Drew Nabb here. Today we're going to talk about steering and alignment. Steer ratio. Steer ratio is the relationship between steering wheel input and the input out at the wheel. Faster steering will turn the wheels more quickly for the same input by the driver at the steering wheel. Slower ratio will turn the wheels slower or require greater steering input by the driver to get the same angle out at the wheel. This becomes important because for the driver, turning the wheel further may actually slow down his response from catching the car during a skid. Having a faster steering ratio will actually also require more effort to turn the wheel the same amount. The steer ratio is picked on the balance between how quickly you need to turn the wheel and what effort the driver can exert without becoming fatigued. Another way you can change the steering ratio without changing the steering rack would be to change the size of the wheel. A bigger wheel will give the driver more mechanical advantage, reducing the perceived force at the steering wheel for the same amount of force at the wheel and tire. A smaller wheel will give you the advantage of being able to turn the wheel more quickly, and for some drivers, depending upon the seating position, you may have to have a smaller wheel to allow their elbows to clear the seat. Steering effort is a concern for most of our race cars, especially in endurance racing, because these races aren't 20 minutes long. They're hours and hours long. Many people neglect to look into steering effort and how much that effort can fatigue the drivers, and over the course of a race lead to a driver making bad decisions or becoming physically incapable of turning the same lap time. Before you remove your power steering, you may want to consider the steering effort and the fatigue that the driver will experience. You can also look at changing your steering geometry, or before you change your geometry, make sure that you haven't influenced it to the point that the car is difficult to turn. Another thing most people neglect is that when you have really high steering efforts, it becomes very difficult to perceive balance changes in the car, and it can be difficult to tell when the car is understeering, skidding, or if you're beginning to oversteer. It also makes corrections difficult to make without overshoot. So how does power steering work? In a power steering system, your car has a hydraulic pump that applies pressure to one port of your steering rack or steering box and has a return port back to the steering pump on the rack. Power steering fluid pressure comes in to the top of your steering rack and then enters a valve. This valve is controlled by a torsion spring, usually a bar, that is attached to your steering column. When you turn the wheel, you twist this T-bar or torsion bar that opens a valve that allows this high pressure to either exit the turn left or turn right ports out of the porting here in your rack. Those ports apply pressure to one side of a piston or the other, providing the assist, which helps reduce the steering effort that you feel at the wheel and help turn the wheels for you. When depowering a power rack, an important consideration for many racks is the stiffness of this T-bar. If this T-bar is really soft, which you see in many cars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, with the engine off, you'll notice that the steering has some slop. You can turn the wheel 20 to 40 degrees before it gets really stiff. You're feeling the displacement of this T-bar. The correct way to depower a power rack is to remove the T-bar and valve assembly, weld or mechanically attach the two together to stiffen the T-bar so it can't deflect, and then reassemble that into your rack. Then you won't have a spring between the steering shaft, which you're turning with the wheel, and the actual rack and pinion section of your steering. In the Neon, I performed this and had to find specialized parts, so you may actually want to ship it out to another vendor, consult the internet, or purchase a manual rack. After you've successfully stiffened up the T-bar assembly, you'll want to loop the inlet and outlet ports that were going to the power steering pump together and fill this with either power steering fluid or another hydraulic oil. Make sure that your loop is away from the exhaust or anything else hot, because this is filled with oil and it can catch on fire. Steering column and wheel adapters. Wheel adapters are used in race cars to allow you to remove the steering wheel to exit the vehicle either during a pit stop or an emergency more quickly and easily. Steering wheel adapters come in several different spline configurations and sizes. You need to make sure that the hub mount section and the section that goes in your steering column are both from the same vendor. Another concern for steering wheel adapters: attachment to the actual steering column. I had a friend in a Spec Miata race get into an accident because the adapter separated from the steering shaft. He suffered compression fractures in his back from hitting the wall and rolling the car over at Watkins Glen. If you choose to use a weld-on adapter, you need to make sure that you weld both the front edge, the back edge, and I strongly recommend putting a through bolt through the bottom of the adapter as a second mechanical means of attachment. I, on this Neon, was able to use a adapter that's actually built for the spline count of the Neon steering shaft. I simply slid it down, attached this nut with a backup washer and Loctite. These are a great option if you do not feel comfortable or do not have a welder you know that you feel comfortable using to weld on a spline adapter. The bolt-on versions can be removed and exchanged from car to car. And in general, I think these are actually probably safer than going through the effort of welding on a steering wheel adapter. If you use an OEM column, you need to make sure that the OEM mounts are used, connecting the intermediate shaft, the U-joints, to the steering column. And for all of these joints, I recommend using the OEM fasteners and having 2 mechanical fastening points for every component. In this case, the D-ring holders are bolted and safety wired in position. You can bolt and weld them to use 2 bolts, but I always make sure I have 2 mechanical fasteners holding every steering component on in my cars. When installing your column, it's important to make sure you use 2 mechanical fasteners at every location. You can see in my car here, I have bolted and safety wired through to make sure that fastener is retained. You can bolt and weld, use 2 bolts, 2 nuts, or you can use a safety cotter pin to the side. On aftermarket columns that use a set screw, I would recommend driving the set screw in and then drilling an alternate through bolt to make sure that you have 2 mechanical fastening points at every single one of the joints. Another important thing to consider when using the OEM column is disabling the factory key lock system that will lock the steering column on most vehicles with the key removed. For a race car, if the key were to be accidentally removed, you need to make sure the steering column doesn't lock and cause an accident. You need to reference your service manual or look online to find how you actually remove the steering lock assembly, remove the spade adapter that will allow the key to lock and unlock the steering column, and after you remove those guts, you'll be able to remove your key, still turn the steering column with the key out. Another thing to keep in mind, in the middle of the night, it's awfully hard to find this key if you drop it. That's why I recommend safety wiring the key to the column in some location so this thing doesn't go missing at the time you need it. Something else to keep in mind when designing and laying out your steering system is the driver control loop. By driver control loop, I mean, what does the driver feel, do, and then respond with given an input from the car? For example, steering slop. If you have slop in your joints, bad tie rods, anything that's worn out in the car, as the driver tries to make a correction, he has to actually turn through this section of travel on the steering wheel with almost no force output. For a lot of drivers, it can be difficult to turn the wheel a little bit and know how far they've turned it until they actually get the sensation of pushing against the steering system and feeling feedback at the wheel. So having an excessive slop can lead to the driver hunting and trying to figure out where he has the wheel turned and how much force he's applying. Another thing that can influence the driver control loop, high steering efforts. Again, if you took your power steering off and you really needed it, you have poor suspension geometry, or the ratio of your steering system is way too high. Really high steering efforts can make it hard for the driver to make very fine force input corrections mid-corner, either during a skid or when trying to figure out what the actual limit is of the tires. For example, if you're only pushing 5 pounds, it's easy to feel a 2 or 3 pound change in steering effort. If you're going for 200 pounds, not only do you get tired and it's hard to feel, but it's awfully hard to feel 201 versus 200 pounds. Another thing to think about is force changes that happen in the steering system. For example, a power steering system that has a poor pump, or if you have steering geometry that changes significantly with travel. Most drivers are force control based drivers. They expect a certain force of the wheel to correspond to a certain balance of the car. Most of us, if we feel the steering go numb, we assume that if it goes numb all of a sudden, the car is probably loose. If the steering effort increases, gets really high, and then starts to plateau out, most of us assume that the car started to get tight and push and understeer. So it's important to make sure that your steering system consistently and effectively gives the correct steering effort back to the driver. Another thing to think about, high steer ratio gearboxes, steering boxes. High steer ratio will allow the driver to make very quick, abrupt changes out at the wheel with fairly small steering inputs. This can be an issue when you're going through a skid or a correction, because it would require the driver to make very fine, small, minute changes with a high steer ratio versus lower steer ratios. The driver has a larger window of steering wheel angle he can leave the wheel at to get the same effect at the wheel. Whether you're lining the car yourself or you're having a shop do it for you, you need to determine what alignment settings you want the car set up to and the implications those settings will have on the performance of your car. Alignments determine the static setting of your suspension. For example, static camber. Dynamic settings of your suspension are determined by the compliance of your suspension and your geometry. This is important to keep in mind because your static suspension settings may not be necessarily your dynamic suspension settings. Many cars lose camber through compliance mid-corner, and just because you put in 4 or 5 degrees of static camber doesn't mean that it will have 4 or 5 degrees of camber mid-corner. This is also important when you're comparing alignments between two different cars that have radically different geometry or compliance, because your static settings may actually result in different dynamic settings. So what are typical camber targets? Well, that kind of depends on what kind of car you're running. In general, you'll find front-wheel drive cars will have a little bit less camber, or at least they will have to consider the effect camber has on the drive and brake and make a trade-off between straight line performance and mid-corner performance. Rear-wheel drive cars, with the exception of heavy braking, can generally run more front camber because they don't suffer from camber reducing their drive force potential. So what's a typical camber target for your car? Well, it depends a lot on what kind of car you run. Front-wheel drive cars will have to trade off between acceleration potential and cornering potential because adding more camber reduces the contact patch longitudinally. This influences the brake performance and acceleration performance for front-wheel drive cars. Rear-wheel drive cars will only have issues with braking performance from added front camber. For this reason, a lot of times rear-wheel drive cars will run slightly more front camber than front-wheel drive cars do. In the rear of rear-wheel drive cars, much like the front of front-wheel drive cars, adding camber will reduce their drive performance. For that reason, most rear-wheel drive cars will run a lot less rear camber than they do in the front of the car. Generally, you see front cambers in cars that we race being between 2 and 4 degrees statically, and rear cambers being between 1 and 3 degrees statically. This can change based on the bearings and the compliance of your particular suspension. In general, suspensions that have a lot of bushing compliance, newer suspensions that run narrow bearings, will have to add about a degree more camber than cars that run better bearings and better compliance. So how do you change or add static camber? Well, again, depends what kind of car you have. Some common options available are slots in your strut tower tops. If you have a strut car, they allow you to move the top of the strut tower in or out. Camber plates, which bolt between the top of the strut and the body of the car, also allowing you to move it in or out. Some cars have adjuster bolts with eccentrics that go between the knuckle and the strut, or in the actual control arm on the inner pivots or outer pivots. Another option available for usually cars that have two control arms is changing the length of the control arm if it has an adjustable link in it. Another option available is to actually bend the knuckle and introduce camber by bending the knuckle where it meets the mount. This is usually the last resort because you have to be careful about cracking the knuckle, making sure you know the metallurgy of the knuckle, and checking it for cracks after you've completed the bending process. Caster effects. What does caster do for your suspension? Caster gives you an idea of how much camber change you create as you turn the wheels. Adding caster will increase the camber on that wheel when you turn. Adding caster will also increase the load on the wheel on the inside during a turn, which helps make the front of a car turn better. Adding caster will also increase your steering gain, meaning for the same amount of steering wheel angle, it will increase the amount of load transfer from left to right, making the car respond more quickly to that steering input. This can be either a positive attribute, if you need to speed up the response from the driver turning the wheel to the car actually turning, or in some cars they can create a over-control condition where the driver is constantly over-controlling by adjusting too much the load change left to right as he's trying to correct from a skid or a spin. So how do you add caster? Like adding camber, on strut cars, you can simply move the upper strut mount, either using slots to move it forward and back, or a plate to move it forward and back. On some cars, you can also change caster by adjusting either the link lengths or eccentric adjusters on one inner pivot or the other of the lower control arm, which will move the ball joint forward or back. Another option to change caster is to use a different knuckle. Another way you can add caster for many cars, sliding the subframe forward or back, because the strut mount stays in the same position and you simply move the control arms forward and back, elongating the holes in your subframe, or loosening the subframe and just pulling it as far as it will travel can change your caster angle. Toe effects. What does toe do? Toe is the angle of the wheel relative to the center line of the car. Towing in turns both wheels in. Towing out means the front of both wheels is facing out relative to the center of the vehicle. We change toe angle to preload the tire in a particular direction. This can also preload your bushings in a particular direction to make up for the compliance that the car has from lateral force. If your vehicle naturally tows out due to its compliance, towing the wheels in could actually lead to the wheels being closer to straight ahead and equal when you're turning. Also changing toe, because it preloads the tire in a particular direction, can bias that axle to being looser or tighter, meaning understeering or oversteering more, because that tire does not have to cross through the straight ahead position where it has zero lateral force. If you think of the tire as being a spring that has some slop in it, toe preloads that spring in one direction, and as you transition by beginning to turn the wheel on entry, whichever end of the car has toe in it, toe in or toe out, may or may not actually go through that point where the tire has zero preload on it laterally. Another advantage of changing your toe would be preloading the tire laterally. When you enter a turn, your tire goes from zero lateral force, if it's pointed straight ahead, to then being loaded up laterally as it creates lateral force. If you preload the tire the opposite direction, as you enter a turn, it goes to this deadband and making no lateral force, and then once it actually gets through that deadband and begins to be loaded laterally like a spring, that tire will generate more lateral force. Towing the car in or out on an axle can change whether that tire experiences this deadband or is preloaded in the direction that you're already turning. For most vehicles, you'll find that they perform better with a little bit of toe in the front, and zero to some vehicles actually prefer toe out. These settings, though, depend entirely upon the compliance of your car and the balance of your car to start with. You may or may not hear the term thrust angle when you're lining your car from the specialist doing it or looking online. Thrust angle is the difference between the average toe in the rear of the car and the center line of the car. You would think of cars that have solid rear axles. That would be the angle, average left to right, that the axle has where the axle is pointing. In front-wheel drive cars, thrust angle isn't really that big of a deal. If both wheels are braking evenly, the thrust angle would be the angle that the braking force is actually net applied to the car. Meaning if you have toe out on one side, the other side is straight, when you hit the wheels, it will actually have a net braking force that wants to rotate the car. You'll find most thrust angles are really small, so this effect is really small as well. On rear-wheel drive cars, the thrust angle, or the average toe, will create a force based on the acceleration of the car pushing at some angle that's not aligned with the center of the car. On throttle, this can create a moment that tries to steer the car one way or the other. Usually this is a bigger effect though for solid axle cars, and in general, if your thrust angle is below a degree, I don't think you'll ever feel it. If your car has been wrecked or has significant thrust angle, you may have to move your mounts, shift over the subframe, or shorten a link to get the thrust angle within a degree or two of straight ahead. Steering acronym. Acronym is the difference in toe between the inside and outside wheel. Most cars have positive acronym, which is where the inside wheel will move more than the outside wheel. You'll find this helps with slow speed turns because on a slow speed turn, the inside wheel has to go through a tighter turn than the outside wheel. For most cars with positive acronym, you'll find that the tie rod mount on the steer arm, if it's behind the center of the hub, will be inboard. Most cars that are going to have pro acronym, the steering arm, if it faces backwards, will be inboard from the ball joint. You can change the acronym by moving the steering rack forward or back, or by using a knuckle that has a different steer arm location for the tie rod. This is usually measured by using toe plates, which can determine the angle the wheels are turned at, or you can use it by using tape measures and comparing the inside and outside rim displacement to the body for the outside and inside wheel. All these are reasons why you need to look into your steering system, ask your drivers what they're feeling, and adjust it to your particular needs. Hope you guys found these tips and pointers on steering systems helpful. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and leave comments if you have any questions. Thanks, guys. Steering ratio. Your car may come with two or multiple. Okay. Another thing. Hello. All right.
Okay, that's the fun. That's all the fun we have today.
Yes, all we get today. All right. Don't fall my foot. for cars that have, damn. Stay put. The next one.
Just boring.
Boring geometry stuff.
Just floor it. Go fast.
Yes. Okay. Yep. Got it now. I hope this helped you understand some geometry, whatever. Okay, yeah.
Dum dum dum.
Dum dum dum. Yes, no, yes, no, yes. Alignment. Why does your car need an alignment? Which is how much the angle of the tire. My God, we got a loose wheel. Oh. Okay.
Been there, done that.
The left front tire. Whoop.
Oh shoot.
Behind the center of the hub will be inboard. Oh my God. Okay.
Oh my God.
Leave any comments on questions you may have, and thanks for watching. Heavy metal. Hit the like button, subscribe, and leave comments if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.